In the previous chapter of Bonita Camp, you learn about the Bonita solution component, and you learn about how to create your first process diagram using BPMN notation. But so far we didn't deal with any data, and data are core in the process. They are needed, for example, to define condition on gateway and to do all the business processing implementing the process definition. So let's take a look about how you manage your business data in Bonita solution. So actually Bonita provide a feature that will handle for you all the action related to data, like storing the data in a database and make easy the creation, update, and all the other operation around data. So for that in Bonita, you will create what we call a business data model. So you create this business data model definition. And actually what this will do, it will create at the same time some Java classes, some POJO to handle the data manipulation, but also it will create the database to save the data you deal with in your process. This is all handled by the Bonita engine. So this is a core service of the Bonita engine, and it relies on a well-known Java library that is called Hibernate to deal with all this persistence action. But let's take a quick look about how we create a data model in Bonita Studio. So when you are in Bonita Studio, you can go in the development menu here, and under business data model you can define your business data model. So basically you will define what we call object. So this is a reference to Java object, and for example, let's say we have an object that will store information about a product, for example, and we can define various attributes for this object, like a name, for example. That will be some text and that will be mandatory. But another one, for example, will be the description. It will be some text, a string again, but maybe optional. And finally, maybe a price. And you can have different type here. For example, we'll use a double here, so a number. And this one is mandatory as well. So this is a basic example of a business data object. But you can of course have more complex objects, like you can have composition of object here. In the drop-down list you can see I can reuse product, or I can aggregate various different objects I define, and I can have different kind of relation when I do so, like aggregation or composition, and we have multiple options around here, but I will not go into detail in this BPM camp. We'll just work with some basic object. Just to let you know, also we take into consideration performance. So you are able to define indexes on your attributes, on your object attributes. They will be used when creating the database tables to have better performance when executing some queries. You also have a predefined set of queries. So this looks like SQL. It's actually GPQL. So you have the basic select queries here, but you can create as well your custom one if needed for specific logic. And finally, like for any database, you can have some constraint, like unicity constraint and some column. Bonita handle for you the generation of a unique ID, but if you need to deal with your own one, for example, you can do this with this unique constraint tab. When you are done with your object definition, you can just click finish, and what actually will happen here behind the scene, you can see it here in the progress bar, is that it built the business data model. So it generates a Java object definition and also creates a table in the test database that is packaged with the studio. So let's take a look here. We have a tool to view the content of this database actually. In the development menu, business data model, you can browse this database. You can see here I use H2 console. So this is the H2 database. It is embedded by default. And you get this web viewer for the database. And you can run some query directly on it. When we use Bonita, we of course won't do manually those queries, but just to see the current data. And you can see right now I don't have any data. There is no rows in my table, but I can find the name of the various attribute as column of my table, like the description, the name, and the price. We have this persistence ID I referred to earlier. This is an internal Bonita unique ID for each row in the table. So now we have a business data model, and Bonita create for us the tables in the database, and we have also, I said, some Java representation of those data. But now let's take a look about how we use it actually in our process. So to use a business data in a process, the first step would be to declare a variable in our process definition, and we'll select the type of this variable as one of the objects we define in our business data model. Once we have some variables, we can do all the standard operation like create, read, update, or delete the data. So for example, to create, so to insert basically a new row in the database table, we usually rely on the variable default value. When we set the default value of a variable, when you start the process, this default value will be set, and the business variable will be saved in the database. We also have what we call operations that are useful to update the data. So for example, if you want to update the data when a task is submitted, you will usually rely on operation. To read the data, usually you call some API of the Bonita engine. You go through the API of Bonita engine to access the data. And you can also read and update the data using connectors. We'll speak about connectors in the next chapter, but basically you can use the business data as connector input or update them as part of the connector output results. One thing important to understand about the business variable is, so you have a reference from one process definition to a business data, but another process can as well work with the same data. You can initialize a business variable with some existing data rather than the new default value that will create a new row in the table. You can search for an existing business data and use it to initialize your process. So for example, with a basic process like vacation management, you can have one process to create a new vacation management and another process definition to update an existing vacation. And the second process to update will work with the existing row in the table with the existing business data. Also, the process definition and the process have the full control over the life cycle of the business data. Like, it's fully controlled by you when you create the data, when it's stored in the database, when you want to delete it. When a process is finished, there is no particular action, for example, on your business data. If you want to delete it, move it to another table, to another system, it's really all up to you to handle the data the way you want. And last point, as I said, we have some APIs for the read operation, but we'll use them when we will work with our user interface definition to see how we can get in our forms data that were stored by the BDM feature. So let's take a quick look now in the studio to see how you define this business variable and how you can actually initialize them. So I will open one of my example process, so this basic one here. And if I go in the data tab here, you see that you have this business variable container here. I will not speak about process variable on the right here. This is more a legacy feature of Bonita. You should preferably use business variable at all time. So let's define a business variable. So for example here, I will name it, for example, demo product. And you can see here, I can select my data type that I defined previously, so the product. And here I have the default value. So I will be able to define this default value. So usually to set this default value, you do it based on some user input. We'll see how we do so a little bit later. But you can also statically define this value. So here we're writing a Groovy script. It's really like Java. So I just create a new product object. And I will be able to set the attribute of my product object. So that, for example, the name. And a price, for example. I will leave the description empty because I set this description as being optional. So here I go. And now if I launch this process, immediately when the process is start, the default value of the business variable are set, and then I should see the data in my H2 database. So let's run the process. So it's packaged all together. I can start it. Now it's started. And if I get back to Bonita Studio and display again the data stored in my database, I should now have an entry for my taste data with the price set, but you can see that the description is empty. It has a null value. If I run again the process, I will have a second line, a second entry. And if needed, in the process, as I said, I can also update the data. So if I select the step, for example, here in execution tab, we have operation. I can add an operation here. And for example, I can select my demo product and I can update one of the attributes. So I use here Java methods. I will, for example, set a description. And here I will just have a constant like test description. And now we'll just run the process to show you that again. So here I start the process. So now if I query the data in the database, we'll see that we have two products, my first execution of the process and the second one. And now if I do the step of my process, so if I go in the portal to see the list of the step here, and if I do this task, I will now see that in the database, the description has been updated. Sorry, I need just to go here and in business data model database, run the query again. And here goes, it updates my description. So now we have data in our process. We are able to store them in the database, and our process can use them to update them, process them with connectors, and so on. But usually it's up to the user to input some data. We want to display the data input by a previous user in another step of the process, and so on. And to do so, we'll have another kind of data we'll use, is what we call the form data. And you define them when you create user interface. So when you use the UI designer to create your user interface, you will be able to declare some data. So as we are in the user web browser, we use JavaScript object for this data, and they will be available only in the user web browser. So basically, when the user display a page, display a form, the variable, the form data, will be initialized, usually maybe with some API call to the Bonita engine querying about the business data value, for example. And those form data will be associated with some widgets, form widgets, to be displayed to the end user. End user will also be able to edit the data by entering values in form widget. And when submitting a form, the data will be sent back to Bonita process. As all the data are in the form and only in the form, they are not stored, they are not persist. So if the user closes the browser, the data are gone. So in order to avoid losing the data, they are usually stored as part of some business variable in the process. Let's have a very quick look right now about how we create those data, but we'll go back later on in the next chapter because it's more related to creation of user interface. So I will just open quickly the UI designer and show you that when we create a form, for example, here, we can define some data. Here you can see we can create a new variable, and actually we have different type, but all of them end up being some JavaScript object, but it's different solution to initialize the value. You put basically a name, and you can have static value, or the value can be the result of an API call, JavaScript exception, and so on. But we'll get back to this in the chapter about user interface. Last point about the widgets, the data. The last option is document management. So documents are handled in a special way with Bonita. They are not stored in the business data model. They are stored separately. Bonita provides a lightweight content management system. And so basically the user will be able to upload a file using a form, and the file will be stored associated with one process definition. When you run the process, it's like from business variable. You can initialize a document that is declared in the process definition. You can update it with a new version. Bonita handles the versioning of documents. And the difference with the business data model is that the document is associated with the process definition. So a document will have a life cycle that is more or less shared with one process instance. If several processes need to collaborate with a single document, they need to pass this reference from one process to another. But we'll not go into too much detail on that. Just let's have a quick look on the way you declare a document in the process. So it's really like declaring some business variable. You select the process pool, you go under data here, and you have document. I can, for example, say that I want the user to upload an Excel file. It will be a single file, meaning it's not a list of documents, but this single file can have multiple versions. I can choose to leave this file empty at the start of my process, or I can grab the file from the contract. So we'll just go on what a contract is in the next slide. So basically initialized with a user input, or a local file. I can embed it, the initial value of my file, in the process definition. For example, it can be useful if you want the user to download a file, fill up, for example, it might be a PDF file, and upload it in the next step of the process. Or you can as well initialize it from an external system. So once I have a document in my process, in the same way I can use operation to update it when I'm on a task. Here you can see I have the document, and I can update it, for example, with a new version. So let's get back to here and a little bit of information about contracts. So contracts basically define what are the data required to either start a process or execute a human task. It's a declaration of the inputs, and also you can optionally define some validation rules on the input. So basically the idea here is to have a lousy coupling between the user interface that might be done with Bonita UI Designer or maybe another solution, and the process execution. And also it's helped to run the process, to guarantee the correct execution of the process by doing a first set of validation on the data provided to the process. So in a classic scenario, you will have, like on this diagram, you will have the user who inputs some data in the process form. The data will be stored in JavaScript variable, and when the user clicks on the submit button of the form, this actually performs an API call to the Bonita engine asking to start a process instance, and the JavaScript variable associated with the submit button will actually provide the data as a JSON payload on the HTTP request to the Bonita engine API. And this JSON will actually be used to initialize the contract. And the contract variable can be used to initialize the business variable defined in the process. So for example, by setting the default value when you start a process, or if it's to execute a task, you can use the contract value in the operation or as connector inputs and in many other ways. So if I do a quick demonstration here in my process, if I select the pool, currently I don't have any contract. I will generate the contract actually from my data. So here I will pick up my demo product, and let's say that I want to ask the user for a product name and price to start the process. I will go on next. You can see here it generates automatically for me the initialization script, the default value of my business variable. So how it does that? What does it do in the default value code here? It will create a new product object, and this demo product input here represents my contract value. So we'll use the name received in the contract value to set the name of this new Java object. Same for the price, and return this new object. And now if I go on my data, pull variable here, I can see that the default value here has been updated, and it will actually use what is provided as contract input. So here I have the demo product input. This is the name of the contract with two attributes, the name and the price. Also now on step 1, I can also add a new contract from data, or I can do it manually. Like I can put a name here, description contract, and if I need to, I can go in operation here, and instead of using a static description like I did previously, I can here use contract inputs to update the attribute of my business variable. So I will use the description contract to set the value of the description of my demo product business variable. So now if I run this process, as I define a contract, I get a form that is generated automatically for me. So I will put a name for my product. I put a price, and I can start the process. And now if I go in the business database, you can see that the value here is taken from my user input instead of having static value as I have previously. And the same way, if I perform the task with a description, here if I go again, check the data, I will have the description updated in the database. Here we go, we have the description. So that's the global overview of the data flow in Bonita. You have the data input in the form by the user and stored in some JavaScript variable. When user click on the submit, those data are carried in the REST API call to the engine as JSON. They are parsed to initialize the contract variable. Then the contract can be used in the business variable default value or using operation or connectors. So now it's time to move on to the second exercise. So far we have a process definition with the different tasks. Now we'll update the process with the data, and you will also be able to update the condition on the transition in your process. Just to show you that, if you have the exclusive gateway outgoing transition, when you select it in a general tab, you can define a condition here, and in this condition, if you create a script, you'll see that in this drop-down list you have access to your business variable. So I can do, for example, demo product price, and if the price is above like 100, I want to take this transition, and maybe if it's below 100, I want to go to another step, so I can make this the default flow. So if the condition is met here, a price higher than 100, I will finish the process. If not, I'll go to the default transition and go to step 2. Now that we have this validation warning here, I just need to trigger again the validation to get rid of it. It's just a notification that all the outgoing transition on an exclusive gateway needs to have a proper condition defined. So now you can try the exercise number 2, and in the next chapter we'll work on creating some custom user interface.